This is Behemoth, the next title from the VR masterminds that brought us the Walking Dead Saints and Sinners titles. Behemoth looks to take the best parts of both Blade and Sorcery and Shadow of the Colossus and then wrap it up in Saints and Sinners' wonderfully weighty physics-based combat, which to me sounds like the perfect recipe for an epic VR adventure. Well, the results are a bit hit or miss. Stick around and I'll explain. Hey guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid and welcome to the channel. If you like this video, give it a like for us, and if you're interested in more VR content, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss new videos as they drop. And of course, if you're looking to join our VR conversations, feel free to leave a comment, or even better, join us each and every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific here for the Virtual Boys podcast. Kicking things off, let's talk a bit about the game's story. Behemoth is an original story set in the Forsaken Lands, a fallen kingdom haunted by tragedy. Here you play as Ren, an outland warrior who must embark on a perilous quest to save yourself and your village from a horrible curse. Monstrous embodiments of the curse, the Behemoths, ravage the Forsaken Lands and corrupt the hearts and minds of those who remain there. Where did these abominations come from and why are they here? These are the answers that you will seek while diving into the game's campaign. Honestly, the story here did very little for me, and I found most of it to be little more than a reason to chop up minions and climb onto the game's 4 primary behemoths. And so with that, let's talk gameplay. Behemoth is a mostly linear adventure broke up over 4 different biomes, with each area building up to, you guessed it, an altercation with one of the game's giant beasts. With an approximately 8-hour runtime, much of the game has players running along the critical path, with exploration mostly relegated to breaking open barrels for health potions and or eating herbs to heal, or occasionally the moments where the game very obviously offers up an alternate path. Taking these alternate paths often lead to slight detours that give up treasures or health potions, but they can also open up into slightly larger and more complex areas, offering up a more meaningful upgrade to your stamina or health, which is often locked behind a puzzle, but more on those in a bit. Level design here, while nice to look at, felt very gamey to me, and instead of feeling like I was on some great grand adventure, I almost always felt like I was kind of a lamb being led to the slaughter, which in the case of this game means a combat arena of some design. Now, before I get into my thoughts around the game's combat, I want to give you a quick rundown of how the game handles movement and your weapon loadout. Here in Behemoth, your character is a bit more agile than what we saw in the Saints and Sinners games. Running is much easier here, and the cost of stamina is not nearly as harsh as that game. You can crouch, but the game has oddly placed that on your square button on your PSVR or the X button on the Quest controller, instead of the usual click of the right analog stick. And the result is a very awkward way of crouching, especially when you put together that with some of the other game's mechanics that also utilize those face buttons. Additionally, the game also implements a dash mechanic that is used to dodge incoming attacks and also to leap forward when climbing, both of which draw from your stamina bar. Finally, and maybe the game's most important movement mechanic, is the implementation of the wrist-launched grappling hook. It's used primarily for swinging across large gaps and scaling cliff sides, but it is later used to grab hard-to-reach items and eventually becomes an important part of your weapon loadout, as you do acquire the ability to grab objects and enemies in combat and yank them around as needed. As a weapon and a pulling tool, I thought the grappling hook was great. Unfortunately though, I found its implementation as a method of transportation often clumsy, clunky, and janky. In an effort to give players more control over the grappling hook, Skydance gives players full control over aiming, retraction, and detachment of the lanyard and your swing momentum. On paper, this sounds awesome, and I actually complained in my review of Batman Arkham Shadow that I wanted that control. However, in practice, Batman had the right idea, as in the middle of combat or when simply traversing parts of the world, I found myself more often than not fighting the grappling hook to just do what I wanted to do. So many times I either couldn't hit a target during combat or rappelled right up to a grapple point just to fall off, or get hung up like an idiot because I forgot that I had to cut the line still. I get it, some may love this level of control, and I thought I would, but it more often than not just ruined my flow both in combat and when just trying to get around. However, all this being said, I must say I did like the way Skydance implemented the grapple and rope mechanic into many of the game's puzzles, as it definitely gave me some real Tomb Raider moments. Now, if you've played Saints and Sinners, then you already probably have a decent idea about how your character's loadout is handled. Again, we have weapon holsters on both hips and 2 slots on your back, with one being on each side of your shoulders. Funny enough, the game doesn't care what size the weapons are, so if you want to drag a greatsword on your waist, well, you do you. Eventually, each of these holster slots though can be doubled up, giving players 8 possible weapon holsters by pressing either the circle or triangle buttons on the PSVR2, which allows you to switch between multiple weapons. But I really wish they just made this a weapon wheel or something, because I found this approach really cumbersome when in practice during the heat of combat, and especially when switching weapons on my back and having no idea what I was actually switched to. And unfortunately, cumbersome is another word that came to mind often while I played this game. Yes, there is a seated mode, but when seated, I felt a little too short, and I wish there was a height adjustment tool. Additionally, you have a pouch on your front that is used to store your health potions, and I found myself often grabbing at them accidentally when reaching for items on the ground. Again, making me wish for an adjustment tool like we found in Arizona Sunshine to place this closer to my body and out of the way. Now, you may be saying, Chris, why are you spending so much time describing these mechanics? Well, that's because I want you to understand my main problem with Behemoth, and unfortunately, that's the combat. Because to put it plainly, and it breaks my heart to say this, I found the combat clunky, cumbersome, often broken, and not a lot of fun. Let me start off by saying that I think melee combat in VR is still to date one of the hardest VR mechanics to nail, and honestly, I don't think anyone has. The struggle is that in VR it's hard to communicate real combat, with weighted weapons feeling sluggish, or your real arms feeling like they aren't synced with the slower movements of your on-screen arms. Of course, stamina has to be dealt with in some way, or else it just becomes a waggle fest. And there's always the issue of creating a sense of impact when you aren't actually hitting something. Honestly, I thought the Walking Dead Saints and Sinners games did a great attempt at this. The two-handed weapons could be a bit janky, but the soft body damage of the combat and how it used arm swing and speed to puncture bodies was fantastic. Unfortunately, while the weighted weapon mechanics feel like they've been ported straight over to Behemoth, which is great, the game has really gamified the way in which damage is inflicted on enemies, opting to go instead with a damage bar above their heads. The result is that you can essentially stab, slash, and straight up beat down an enemy, armored or not, but until you've gotten their damage down to where it is considered a critical blow, you can't puncture the body, cut off a limb, or any other type of critical hit. Now, I can see some liking the fact that they simply can't come up to an enemy and make them an amputee simply to watch them crawl around on their stubs. But I do. Now, yes, I can see what Skydance is going for, as they want combat encounters to actually be difficult and not just kill shots, but the AI of attacking enemies just isn't good enough to feel authentic, and they usually fall into scripted attack and dodge routines. Making matters worse, the game doesn't allow you to simply block incoming attacks with your weapon, and instead it requires you to swing into the enemy's swing path with a sword in order to parry it. Attacks can be blocked by using a shield, but since enemy armor is most easily broken by an axe, and axes can't parry attacks, you see my issue. Now, when combined with the cumbersomeness of switching holstered weapons and the fact that you now also likely have a bow and throwing knives, and the whole process just feels clunky, as the game really requires you to use all these weapons in order to be effective against different types of enemies. However, Behemoth also has what they call a strength ability, one which employs a quick cooldown between uses. It essentially offers players 5 seconds of rage and increased strength. The game focuses heavily on this ability, as it is upgraded and utilized throughout the entire campaign. Is it fun? Yes. But unfortunately, it also breaks essentially every combat system I just mentioned, for when combined with like a greatsword, players can essentially just activate the ability and cheese anything in their way short of a mini-boss fight. And the game keeps doubling down on this ability as it piles on more combat options that utilize the strength ability, such as turning your weapons into boomerangs that come back once thrown, and allowing you to grapple onto enemies and yank them off ledges or right into your sword. This leads me to another issue that I have with the combat balancing here. After you meet and beat the first Behemoth, you will now have access to a magic sword and a magic bow, both of which can be upgraded using ore that you will find by killing enemies or breaking open barrels. Outside of the basic character upgrades the game doles out and the ability to increase your health and stamina levels, this really is the game's only form of a meaningful upgrade system, and these are also the only weapons you can upgrade or modify at all. Now, while I'm happy to have some sort of depth of gameplay here, and I do like that there is some progression attached to weapons, the upgrade trees on both weapons are so simple that players are given little choice in how or what they want to upgrade. Saints and Sinners excelled in this area, as players could choose what resources to scrounge for and what weapons or gear paths they wanted to work towards in order to better suit their desired playstyle. This is all gone here, and what we're left with is a cookie cutter paint by numbers hand-holdy system of attaboy upgrades to make us feel like we're a participant in the game. Unfortunately, games like Asgard's Wrath 2 and Legendary Tales exist, and I expect better from a developer of this caliber. Adding insult to injury, once you have the magic bow with its unlimited ammo and a magic sword with a few upgrades, using other weapons just don't really matter unless you kind of want to. So yeah, I found the combat a slog here, and that's really unfortunate, for the game is built upon its combat system. Like I said earlier, the game is essentially made up of linear paths that lead players to arenas where they'll take on waves of enemies until the area is cleared and a path forward opens up. The arenas themselves are neat, and they do offer up some cool environmental traps that you can trigger, but the combat itself is just clumsy, and it often just felt like a chore. Some light puzzles are a fun distraction, but they all essentially involve things like shooting targets, moving boxes, and using pressure plates to open doors, so they get old quick too. Now, I know what you're thinking, what about the Behemoths? Well, they look great, and they definitely offered up some of the biggest holy shit moments I've ever had in VR, as I looked up at this giant walking skyscraper, and my PSVR2 headset haptics rattled with each footstep. Those looking for Shadow of Colossus in VR, you will likely be pleased, but probably also left a bit wanting, as the game continues its trend of being very handholdy, as it will literally tell you exactly what to do and when to do it in order to take down one of these beasts, making me wish that they would give players the option to turn hints off when they were in these encounters. And honestly guys, that's all I want to say or show about the Behemoths, because for many those are sure to be the reason to keep playing. And speaking of keeping playing, there are plenty of treasures and collectibles strewn throughout the levels, and you can track these collectibles on your scroll and even fast travel back to old areas to find the ones you might have missed. Consequently, for those who care, you can also head at any time back to your base of operations that you will find after the first Behemoth. Here, you will find a trophy room that houses and displays all the collectibles that you found. Additionally, there is a standalone arena mode that right now offers up only one arena, but there's more coming in future updates. Here, players can practice and hone their skills with all their found weapons and unlocked abilities in a single-player wave-based format. Now, graphics-wise, Behemoth is also a mixed bag. I primarily played the PSVR2 version, but I also had the opportunity to play the Quest 3 and PC versions as well. All in all, Behemoth is a beautiful looking game, and especially when looking at the PSVR2 version. It thankfully uses dynamic foveated rendering, and I believe it is hitting a native 90 FPS with no reprojection. If you played Saints and Sinners Retribution on the PSVR2, you know how great that looked to the headset, so expect that level of sharpness and smooth gameplay. Textures can look a little muddy if you're really looking up close at things, and there are a lot of tricks going on with the lighting, but Skydance has really dialed it in with everything looking really pretty and AAA unless you really go searching for it. Enemies can look a little basic, especially in the face, but other than that, Behemoth certainly feels like a nice step up visually from The Walking Dead, as it does shed that graphic novel visual style for something a little more grounded and visually impressive. Quest 3 users, you can expect some lower resolution textures throughout and an overall downgrade to lighting and particle effects. Additionally, the game does noticeably have to use foveated rendering techniques, so there are some visible downgrades to texture details as you look out, and most notably at the sides of the screen. Don't get me wrong though guys, considering this game on PC requires a 3060 and recommends a 3080 GPU to run, Skydance has done an incredible job of making this work on the Quest 3. And well, of course, for the PSVR 2, it's certainly a testament to what the PS5 can do when using eye tracking, as it gets within spitting distance of the PC version, and that's without the Pro. Now, unfortunately, though, the game is not without its issues, some of which we have heard will or should be fixed with a Day 1 patch on the PSVR 2 and a Day 7 patch on the Quest 3. Both the PSVR and Quest versions suffer from texture pop-in and texture flickering. They also suffer from their fair share of NPCs clipping into walls and floors, and a multitude of other graphical issues both in and out of combat. Some of these are supposed to be fixed, like I said, but until it's done, this is the version that we actually have. More concerning though are the number of serious, almost game-breaking bugs that I ran into while playing the PSVR 2 version. On multiple occasions, I had areas I couldn't clear, either because a door wouldn't open or enemies were stuck behind walls. I even had a boss fight where the boss disappeared, leaving nothing but a health bar above its head. I reset the fight only to have him commit suicide and then just let me through and gave me the achievement. The game was delayed once already, and my current takeaway, purely from a game stability and graphical standpoint, is that it needed to wait until after Christmas. Unfortunately, this is the exact same situation Saints and Sinners Retribution ran into around the same time a few years ago, so it's really frustrating to see it happen again. Sound-wise, Skydance has always been first-rate, and Behemoth is no different. The soundtrack most definitely is coming from the same composer as the Saints and Sinners game, as it shares more than a few musical similarities here.
You made it!
How'd you get here before me?
I'll wear your skin!
That being said, it suits the game perfectly, and the score really shines during the game's more epic Behemoth encounters. Voice acting is again top-notch, and while I had a lot to complain about when it came to the game's combat, the sound side of things was not one of them, as everything sounds large, heavy, and very impactful. And that brings me to my final thoughts and review score. It pains me to be so harsh on this game, guys, as both of the Saints and Sinners games are still to this day some of the finest VR games ever made. Unfortunately for me, Behemoth just misses the mark. The Behemoth battles are awesome to behold and definitely VR candy, but as a game that is based around its combat systems, I found the combat here boring, clunky, and simply unfun. The combination of Saints and Sinners' weighted weapons and soft body physics should have been a home run for a game like this. But a needlessly busy inventory system, when combined with a heavily gamified and hand-holdy take on melee combat, for me, ruins what should have been a gloriously bloody head-bashing playground of fun. The game sounds great, and it's visually impressive, but it is certainly hindered with a plethora of visual and gameplay bugs that may or may not be fixed at launch. As such, I think the game should have been delayed further in order to allow for more polish and playtesting. Ultimately, I didn't hate Behemoth, I was just disappointed in it. The VR Grid gives Behemoth a 7 out of 10. Anyways, guys, that's it for me. I'm really curious to see what you guys think of this game. If you pick it up and play it, I'd love for you to come back and let me know what you think. I'm wondering if my point of view is going to be very divisive. I don't know. I think I'm on point, but maybe this just isn't the game for me. So let me know in the comments below. Guys, it's Chris from the VR Grid, and as always, I will catch you on the next video.